Good morning and welcome to Sunday Coffee, Art, Design, and Architecture. And a happy Sunday morning and welcome to my show. This is coming to you from Florida on a gorgeous Sunday morning overlooking the gentle lapping waves on the Gulf of Mexico. My motivation for this podcast channel is to broadcast good news stories, interesting people, and food for thought. So pour yourself a nice hot cup of tea or coffee, take a deep breath, get cozy, and enjoy a break for some uplifting conversations. Today's book is Ecologies of Inception, Design Potentials on a Warming Planet by Simone Ferracina, published by Routledge in 2022. Mr. Ferracina is the founding director of Exactive Design Office and a lecturer in the Architectural Design and Detail at Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at the University of Edinburgh. Good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Tricia, and thank you for having me.
Well, let me ask you, do you got a cup of tea or coffee ready this morning? What are you drinking?
I'm drinking a glass of water for now, but I have, I think, a black coffee sweetened with honey a little bit later.
Oh, that sounds like an excellent ending to the show. Well, let's start with I gave a little introduction for our audience, but can you tell them a little bit more about yourself and your educational background?
Sure. My name is Simone Ferracina. I'm Italian. I studied architecture in Switzerland at the Academy of Architecture with the likes of Peter Zumthor, Leonardo Benevolo, and Kenneth Frampton, who was my diploma supervisor. During my university career, I spent a year at the École d'Architecture de Paris-Belleville in Paris and was a student of the late French architect Michel Cagon, for whom I spent a few summers working, and spent another year in Madrid working in a small architecture office there run by Elena Farini and Alan Presnick. Then, after graduating with a diploma of architect, a 6-year combined bachelor's and master's of science degree, I promptly moved to New York City, where I started working for Richard Murray and Partners Architects. I spent 13 years with the company and designed a wide range of buildings, particularly in Italy, Czech Republic, and Taiwan. And as a project architect and project manager, saw a few of them through all the way to completion, notably a research center in Bergamo and a bridge/public plaza on the River Tanaro in Alessandria, both in Italy. And I take the time to list all of this to make very clear that while the book we're talking about today has a, let's say, theoretical bent to it, it is very much informed on a fundamental level by the demands of practice. It is in many ways a response to my experience in the real world of star architecture and building construction. In any case, I became increasingly dissatisfied with the scope of this work and interested in questions rather than answers or solutions, or in broader methodological and systemic frameworks rather than in specific design decisions, and slowly drifted towards academia, first founding an online magazine on experimental and transdisciplinary design research, Organs Everywhere, which has now become the OE Case Files book series published by Books. Then acquiring a PhD in philosophy, art, and social thought at the European Graduate School under the supervision of philosopher Graham Harman, and eventually moving to the UK to collaborate with Professor Richard Armstrong and the Experimental Architecture Group on the Living Architecture Project, which prototyped the symbiotic combination of microorganisms, human beings, and their living spaces. And after a few years at Newcastle University, I became a lecturer in architectural design and detail, what would be an associate professor in the States at the University of Edinburgh, more specifically at the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, ISALA, where I currently teach and carry out research.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really seems to be a great formula for an awesome professor is My best professors, I went to the University of West Florida in Pensacola. They always they went to school, they went out and practiced for a long time, and then they brought that back to the classroom.
Right.
And that's a very thank you. That's a very good distinction. I really like that. So let me ask you. My first question is, what was your motivation for writing this particular book?
It's a very good question. I had a couple of questions buzzing in my ear for a long time. On one side, in the context of the climate emergency and its ongoing and very visible effects on human and natural systems, of a dwindling CO2 budget, and of the construction industry's massive contributions to both global carbon emissions, almost 40%, and waste generation, 60% in Europe, including demolition, mining, and quarrying activities. I began asking the obvious question, how do we radically transform design practices so that they become forms of environmental stewardship and care, as opposed to drivers of planet destroying activities? A more formal articulation being, how do we, designers of buildings, but also designers of all sorts of other stuff, and of course, this is a very Western and privileged we begin to recognize and forswear our contributions to ecocide. And how do we decouple design potentials from ecologies of extraction, exploitation, obsolescence, and from the imperative of economic growth? And this is not an entirely theoretical or speculative question. The book is filled with examples and images of projects that move precisely in this direction, leading the way. On the other side, going back to your question about the motivation for writing the book, I observed the pervasiveness of what I call technical tabula rasa, the tendency of every project to start from scratch, not only in the sense of occupying an empty plot of land, but rather of depending almost exclusively on the extraction and processing of primary construction materials, on new and purified substances that bear no traces of previous lives, landscapes, or intentions, and are understood to be relatively formless or capable of attaining many different forms. And here my question was, why is this the case? Why is this approach so prevalent and even commonsensical in Western culture? Why do materials mostly come into the picture as a way to translate and embody a design? Why do we assume that form is imparted by a designer onto a formless substrate, as opposed to negotiated with that which already exists and has form, or passed down from one generation to the next? And the answer I found, as is the case with many problematic facets of contemporary life, can be traced back to Aristotle and his theory of substance. Aristotle separates matter, hyle, from form, morphe, and associates them with potentiality and actuality, respectively. So, according to this view, on one side, a wet lump of clay, a material, is assumed to be malleable and capable of changing into many different shapes, and therefore rich in potentials. And on the other, the fired clay figurine into which that material is formed is understood to be fixed or actualized, and therefore incapable of changing. And it is this basic but commonsensical understanding of potentiality as necessarily dependent on a raw and formless materiality that determines many of our attitudes towards objects, their ability to change, and their value. And the validity of this understanding is what the book aims to undermine and unravel, starting with the notion of ecology of inception.
Yes, that's well, you answered my next question. What is this tabula rasa? And then I was like, what is the ecology of inception? What does that mean exactly?
Well, as I mentioned, it was Aristotle's separation of matter and from form or hylomorphism that identified potentiality, so the ability to do or the ability to change, as the key problem this book needed to grapple with. And the first step to do this was to understand it in the context of design. Potentiality does not rely on the intrinsic properties of an object, but on how these contribute to a broader set or environment. So, for example, a pencil is not a pencil, meaning an object used to make marks, to draw, etc., in the middle of a glacier or in the depths of an ocean, but only in relation to at least a sheet of paper and a human hand. In other words, the potential to write or draw does not fully belong to the pencil, but is a function of its encounter with a broader constellation of objects. And it is these constellations designed to target and achieve specific potentials that I call ecology of inception. Therefore, an ecology of inception orients objects towards one another and allows them to be understood together and to share common languages and functional scripts. I chose the word ecology from the Greek oikos, meaning family or house, to suggest a kind of fundamental relational unit. And the term inception, because on one side, the Latin incipere, to begin, and capere, to be receptive, to grasp, foreground the ways in which tuning objects towards one another might spark new performances and interactions. For example, my ability to grab the pencil and draw a figure on a sheet of paper. On the other, however, in capere, so to capture in, to enclose, also alludes to the violence implicit in annexation, appropriation, and inclusion. It suggests that making useful or powerful within an ecology is simultaneously a making useless and powerless of something else, of something or someone other left outside of it. And this process of purification is a key ingredient in the technical tabula rasa. Purification not only as the removal of impurities from, let's say, gold ore to pure gold, but also the removal of that which obstructs access, that stands between. So the material excavated to reach a gold-bearing vein, or the habitats and livelihoods disrupted to reach the lithium beneath salt flats in Chile, for example. Gabriel Hecht, in a great article entitled Human Crap, writes that a typical 14-karat gold chain leaves 1 ton of waste rock in South Africa. So this is the kind of reality I wanted Ecologies of Inception to underscore. In any case, drawing the boundaries of an ecology of inception sets the parameters according to which items are included in, but also excluded from such an ecology. And membership in an ecology is not granted once and for all, but depends on an object's continued ability to perform and comply. When the pencil breaks and can no longer be used in an ecology of drawing, or when the design of the rotor blade in a wind turbine is superseded and can no longer deliver the most efficient output in an ecology of energy production, or when a vacant building in need of repairs no longer abides by an ecology of real estate development that ultimately aims to maximize land value. These objects are deemed worthless and thrown away, discarded and demolished, and eventually burned or landfilled. So in this sense, ecologies of inception are both value-making and value-raising machines. And importantly, they are both at the same time. But there's also a message of hope. If on one side, seeing design through the lens of ecologies of inception foregrounds its inherent violence, on the other, it makes clear that specific roles and functions, as well as the values we associate with them, are fundamentally relational and therefore to a degree unstable. So, always capable of being otherwise, of unlocking different powers. I'm really interested in this tension between a design or original set of purposes and ecological scripts and secondary uses, misuses, reuses, and diversions of all kinds. And the book is developed in conversation with a number of authors and concepts that contribute nuances to this tension. Mary Douglas's work on purity, for example, according to which the attribution of dirtiness is never objective or universal, but always dependent on particular systems of classification. So, for example, the shoes are not dirty in themselves, or when we are wearing them in the middle of a field. They are indeed dirty when placed onto the kitchen counter.
Mm.
The practice of technological disobedience, discussed by Ernesto Rosa in the context of Cuban design. And here, the scarcity of resources prompted not only a way of life based on self sufficiency, repair, storage, and absolutely ingenious, brilliant repurposing, but also a growing disrespect, and this is a quote, for an object's identity and for the truth and authority it embodies. Another ally in this trajectory is the philosophy of the broken, described by Alfred Sohn-Brettel in the context of Neapolitan technology, which hinges upon making what is broken work, all the while abhorring the idea that repairs could last. Another key voice in the book is Sarah Med and her notion of queer use that is used in ways other than for which they were intended to be used, or, and this is the important addition, I think, by those other than for whom they were intended, which turns the violence of ecologies of inception on their head, showing that a change of user brings about a change in what the thing used actually is. Another key voice in the book is Giorgio Agamben and the notion of inoperativity, which, in the example I use in the book, suspends the normal physiological functions of the organs in the resurrected body in paradise, and thus opens them up to new uses. And finally, Graham Harman's dormant objects, which underscore the impossibility of total transparency, the fact that objects can never be known, understood, or related to in their entirety. So this is just to mention a few. And from a practical perspective, these ideas are accompanied throughout the book by brilliant examples of reuse and repurposing, including the image on the cover, which you can see here, but you can Google it, which is of the Vicado playground in Rotterdam, designed by Superuse Studios, where discarded rotor blades, which are usually landfilled, are instead turned into tunnels, towers, and structures around which children can play.
It kind of jumped over some of my questions to actually something a little later in the book that it gets a little philosophical, but very practical too. I really like that about the book, and I since they're listening in the audience, this book is I found to be really easy to read, but it's dense, but don't let that intimidate you because it's really very easy to read. Philosophical and practical. It's got a very nice balance. I found in here we're talking about the idea of cleanliness and what is garbage and what is dirtiness. Can you tell me more about it? Was I believe his name is pronounced, if I could say it right, Dominique Laporte, and it was talking about, I found this fascinating. One cannot be cleansed without a master, that purity is nothing but a corollary of power, the very ability to assign dirtiness. I was like, wow, that's deep.
Yes, I mean, it turns out that dirtiness, and again, it goes back to fundamentally Mary Douglas as well as the idea that these things are not really absolute. They're not universal. They tend to be naturalized to a degree that we don't question where they come from or who makes those decisions. But actually, at some point, someone made a decision, and there is a specific context of framing for something to be dirty or valuable or weak or to become waste. So one of this is one of the ideas the book really hinges upon, the fact that objects are never quite only what we assume they are, and they're not even necessarily what we design them to be entirely, but they can become something else. There's always a hidden side to the material world and to other beings that allows them to always become otherwise. And it is this ability to be otherwise, to turn things otherwise, that drives, I think, in a very fundamental way, a lot of the work in the book, particularly then going, again, as you say, into a more practical direction, which is thinking about questions of how materials circulate and reuse and repurposing in particular. What does it mean to turn an object? And these are terms we tend to use with a degree of confusion. Terms like recycle, upcycle, reuse, and repurpose. But if we want to become proficient in the design protocols associated with these words, and if we want to be able to spot, as you were mentioning, in the work of Laporte and I said Latour and Max Libra and all these people who have showed that dirt is always a political category, and nature also is a political category. So if you want to be able to spot these imbalances of power, we must also gain, I think, a higher degree of precision in the way we use terminology. So if I say that I sliced an apple, we can all more or less picture what I did, even if we don't know exactly the dimensions of the apple or of the slices or what kind of knife I used. But if I say I upcycled a chair, I don't think that anyone could quite get a sense of what exactly I did. Did I shred it? Did I repair it? Did I build the desk with it? Did I repaint it? Did I sell it for more than I paid for it? So this is the fundamental problem. We need to understand what precise operations are associated with these terms so that we can use them with confidence. So taking this largely from the French difference between réemploi and détournement, I use the term reuse to refer to ecological changes, that is, changes pertaining to the membership in Ecologies of Inception, that maintain the formal and functional orientation of an object. For example, when architects Flores and Prats take the windows and doors in Sala Beckett, their wonderful project in Barcelona, repair, recondition, and repaint them, and then move them to a different location within the building where it will still be used as windows and doors. I use the term repurposing to denote ecological changes that largely maintain formal features but divert them toward new functional orientations, as in the Mikado Playground mentioned before, or in the Lions Park Playscape designed by Rose Studio in Greensboro, Alabama, where galvanized drums, which are originally used to store mint oil, are turned into cylindrical floor, wall, and soffit elements. Or again, as in the piano dome in Edinburgh, where the components of disassembled pianos are reassembled to form an auditorium and collaborative spatial musical instrument. And again, the ability to turn things upside down and the power embodied within them as well to re-articulate it. And finally, recycling destroys both the formal macro properties of an object and its functional orientation. For instance, a tire that is shredded and turned into post-consumer tiles or wallets, or an aluminum window frame that is remelted into a billet and extruded into new forms. And here the terms downcycling and upcycling simply refer to recycling operations that either decrease the quality of a material or maintain it the same, with the notional possibility of recirculating it in perpetuity. Very much notional. But what is critical here, and the reason why also the book draws a very sharp line between reuse and repurposing on one side and recycling on the other, is the fact that the ability to recycle the entirety of an aluminum window frame, for example, admirable as it may seem, still dissipates the 54 kilograms of minerals, 5 kilograms of chemicals, 70 kilograms of water, and 39 kilograms of fossil fuels required to manufacture it. And these are Marion Cherta's figures, by the way. It still nullifies and makes vain the labor expended and damage, environmental and otherwise, caused in bringing the original object into existence. And in addition, it sanctions the sustainability, in quotes, and desirability of the comparatively moderate damage inflicted by the secondary processing of scrap aluminum, which, as Carl Zimring has shown in his fantastic book, Aluminum Upcycled, is not only still destructive, but also ends up increasing the demands for aluminum, fueling its spectacularly destructive, to quote Zimring, primary production. And it is because of the need to separate, to pull apart these opposite approaches of reuse and repurposing on one side and recycling on the other, that I have trouble, for example, with the circular economy as a broad umbrella and all-inclusive metaphor. And it is also worth noting something else, that by largely maintaining existing forms, reuse and repurposing reject hydromorphism, reject the Aristotelian idea that potentiality depends on the absence or dissolution of form, depends on a purified and formless matter. Whereas recycling is, of course, an exact and quite literal translation and implementation of that idea.
Yes, kind of covered a lot of my questions. And, I think even from a young age, I just had an awareness for some reason maybe because I live next to a forest and
Right?
of the value of trees and nature and then I just love paper. Then it's like I feel bad. I love paper. I think it's so pretty. And maybe I got a BA in art too. I'm collecting a few degrees. And And I love the film, but I was like, I've always felt like I want to at least honor the tree by using the paper to its fullest extent before, I hate to say it, it gets tossed into garbage or I save it somewhere or something like that. And I was kind of thinking about this book and this interview, and I was wondering, looking around my house too, can we live? I know it takes energy to get everything here, but it is here now. Can we live in a garbage free society? Do we have enough stuff to last us now a long time without having to create mound fields of garbage?
That is a very good and very difficult question to answer. I think we can move towards understanding how to live with the stuff that we've already produced. I think one of the key problems, again, with things like the circular economy, is the assumption that we can solve a problem. And I think we have to move towards finding new ways of living with problems, of, like Donna Haraway says, staying with the trouble. So, for example, looking at the circular economy, as I mentioned, from the perspective I use throughout the book, which is that of Aristotle's hylomorphism. So, looking at through the two terms matter and form, let's say, we can understand in a linear system of production, or we can understand a linear system of production as one that transforms a matter input into a form output, let's say, and eventually releases it as waste. So matter, form, waste. A circular mode of production, in the best of cases, links the first and last steps, matter and waste, and therefore turns the latter into the input for a new productive cycle or ecology. Matter, form, waste, matter, form, waste, matter, and so on. Yet in both cases, the potentials required to fuel the operation, so I'm giving a transversal answer here, rely on the potentializing force of a matter input and assume both matter and form to be objective things in the world. So timber and a table, clay and a brick. Instead, in the book, I propose what I call a nodal approach, which does not follow Aristotle in coupling matter with potentiality and form with actuality, but understands matter and form to be roles that any object can in principle perform. So switches that can be relationally and contextually turned on or off. So, for example, to the lumberjack, you were talking about the tree. The tree to the lumberjack is raw matter, and the log is foreign matter. The log is at the end of his operation. To the sawyer, the log is raw matter, and the board is formed matter. To the carpenter, the board is raw matter, and the chair is formed matter, and so on. So matter and form here are not the beginning and end points of material processes, but the roles performed during them, during operations such as logging, sewing, and woodworking. In any case, so the nodal economy sees the objects around us and the objects that in part we already have, and the many ones that are very valuable that we have been landfilling. Aluminum is one of the most environmentally destructive materials, and we use it for things like tinfoils and packages and really ridiculous consumer goods. In any case, there are many debates in fields such as industrial ecology and discard studies that call into question, for example, the viability of the circular economy. which I discuss in the book, and I've mentioned some of them. At a fundamental level, the notion of material circularity, which might be that notion of can we live with no new objects, and circularity as a metaphor, seen from the perspective of technical nutrients, so the circulation of pure atoms and molecules, is one that, for me, not only perpetuates polymorphism in its key assumption, again, that only broken down, melted, ground, shredded matter, and not actualized objects can be repotentialized, and therefore constructs the disposability of all those objects and materials that don't comply, but also critically fails to curb material throughput. And I think this is the real key question. In other words, the idea that materials could be continually recirculated might suggest that to a high percentage of recycling corresponds a sharp decrease in primary production. In other words, that those same materials are the ones that keep circulating. But as Samantha McBride points out in her study of recycling in the United States, that tends to not be the case. The risk of bundling reuse, repairing, and repurposing practices with recycling and upcycling ones under the circular economy umbrella is that we effectively create a kind of smokescreen under which the same levels of primary production and business as usual can continue, coupled with the illusion that the problems we face are only design or economic problems that can be addressed or resolved by creative people or by generous and enlightened CEOs, rather than broader societal ones that require fundamental shifts in the way we relate and attribute value to things and to one another. So I think one of the key questions is, instead of speaking about things like circularity, can we start very directly talking about a reduction in primary production for those materials that are terribly damaging to the environment, and shift that production towards regenerative materials, organic materials that are beneficial to the environment, and then can be easily grown, and then we can imagine a very prosperous and sustainable future with.
Yeah, because I was thinking about, like, they've had a lot of clear cutting in this area where I'm at. It's like, that tree is 200-300 years old. And once it's destroyed, that's it. It's not gonna, our upcycling, recycling, and everything, it makes us feel good, that's for sure, but it doesn't grow that tree back in any, and not in my lifetime, it won't. I mean, that tree's beyond my lifetime. But then I'm like, well, I like pencils, and obviously I like to draw, and I love to do art, and I'm like, I'm trying to resolve this conflict too, to be sustainable. I don't want to cut down more trees than I have to. I don't know. I've almost got more questions now than I have answers.
Well, the one of the reasons, I guess, is that we tend to look for quite easy answers, and I think we have to increasingly admit that those don't really exist. So you're right in saying that, for example, using timber in construction is, or shifting from using materials like steel or concrete towards materials like timber is certainly what we have to do, but we have to do it within still kind of a reasoned, with a reasoned and system, in a way that looks out at broader systems, and not assume that just using timbers will solve the problem. Because of course, you're right. I mean, using timber will solve the problem if forestry, with forestry management that allows for growth times and understands the different types of timber and the different types of forest, and how to keep that sustainable. It's not that saying let's use timber by itself will do that kind of job. So that's undoubtedly part of it. I mean, I think another component is really starting to conceptualize materials differently. So we tend to assume that materials are things that are out there, that exist, right? That I can count on with my fingers. There's concrete, there's stone, and the various typologies of those. There's sand and this, and that kind of detaches materials from the knowledges and the situated systems that they depend on. So, for example, I run, and I talk about this briefly in the book, a studio unit at Isala called Radical Harvest. It's a third-year design studio, and it asks students to study the waste flows in a city block and then to divert them, to select a few discarded materials, start collecting them, and prototype ways to reactivate and revalue them through design. And what is interesting about the studio are not only the final outputs or tectonic solutions that emerge from it, which have ranged from felt made out of human hair to surfaces made of slumped glass bottles to furniture made out of hangers or corks or milk cartons, etc. And images in the book show some examples of this brilliant work. But the fact that the design process is driven by these objects begins with and is steered by an encounter with these pre-existing materials. And this is, of course, the opposite of what typically happens in an architectural project, where materials tend to embody a form rather than bringing one to the table, or translate an intention rather than preceding one. So on one side, the studio follows many of the practices I discuss in the book, including superuse studios, round labor, refunk, Baker Brown, etc., in expanding the range of possible materials used in construction. And I refer to this as omnivorous architecture. But on the other side, and maybe more importantly, it makes it impossible to decouple materials from the situated ecologies, knowledges, and protocols that turned them into materials in the first place. And the other, perhaps interesting aspect of this is the fact that in order to source the necessary materials in the required quantities, the students have to weave networks of collaboration, care, and trust with the people working in local bars, hairdressers, bike shops, restaurants, cafes, etc., who are asked to go out of their way to set aside, collect, or separate discarded materials for the students, and to continue to do so over the course of several weeks. And following these weekly collections of materials, the work of preparation often involves washing and drying, repairing and mending practices. And this usefully reframes and reconfigures architectural design, questioning the presumed separation of intellectual and manual labor, design, building, and maintenance. So while this project had a very limited impact on real-world waste flows or on the reduction of actual material throughput, my hope is that they offer an ethical regrounding of design and materials. And then they promote environmental responsibility, not as a form of expertise that can be gained, or not only, but as a collective and collaborative form of life and project.
Well, for all the students out there who'd like to go into architecture, they got to check out the University of Edinburgh. That sounds like a really fun design studio.
Yeah, absolutely. Do come.
Oh, that sounds, yes, right up my alleyway. Probably for the people listening too. Well, I know we've taken up a lot of your time today, and my cup of Darjeeling tea is just about finished. And I want to thank you so much for being here. This has been a great interview, etc. And I encourage everybody to go out and check out your book. Can you tell us, Simone, what are you working on now?
I have a few ongoing projects at various stages of development. The first one is a collaboration with Alessandro Poli, radical architect of Super Studio fame, which focuses on a project, Zeno, self-sufficient culture. Poli developed between 1972 and 1980 and exhibited with Super Studio at the 1978 Venice Biennale, which documents the life of Tuscan farmer Zeno Fiaschi, and captures, bringing it to the fore of architectural discourse and attention, let's say, a way of life steeped in routines of maintenance, care, use, and reuse. And there are a couple of images already of that project in Ecologies of Inception. And other projects also concern reuse, both in the context of teaching and pedagogy and in the context of research and writing. Shifting the focus now towards and further developing the notion of ecology of suspension, which we didn't get a chance to talk about today. So the intellectual and material infrastructures required to patch over and bridge across specific projects, uses, and generations of users or inhabitants.
Well, that's okay. The audience, they'll just have to go out and buy the book.
Yes.
We've only got an hour here, but this has been a very good, a very enlightening book, very different way I really like of thinking about objects, things, forms, design, and etc. So, well, for the audience, I guess you've probably finished your cup of tea too.
Yes.
That's it. The book is Ecologies of Inception, Design Potentials on a Warming Planet. Written by, let me get my Italian accent here, Simone Ferracina, published by Routledge in 2022, and the links are listed below in this podcast. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Tricia.
And I'd like to thank the audience for listening. We'll see you next week.